May 10, 1804. Accomack County, Virginia. The bay wind came in low and steady, lifting the porch curtain like breath lifting a chest, and the bell rope in the hall stirred once against its little door as if remembering its use. The house itself held a hush that was not peace, the way certain churches do when the sermon has turned against the living. Folks on the road said the farmhouse looked tidy from the lane. They did not have to hear the bolts. If stories that peel back polite words to show the iron underneath are your kind, tap subscribe and ring the bell. This house holds 4 phases and none of them sit easy. Tell in the comments which county or parish raised you. Names keep the ground honest when men won't. He was Nathaniel Ashe, 50 if the candles counted right, and he kept 2 ledgers on the cherry wood desk in the front room where light fell just so at mid-morning. One ledger anybody could see: salt pork, seed, molasses, shoeing. The little notes of a storekeeper farmer who could tell a neighbor's season by the shape of his signature. The other he called the quiet book. Calf-bound, blue ink neat as a hymn copied out, columns that ran down like stocks on a gallows: arrear, security, indenture, placement, recovery. He wrote names there in a hand that never shook, and made those names do a kind of labor even before the bodies were called for it. The county understood men like him. The vestryman in the next parish borrowed the word steward when he spoke of Nathaniel, and the justice of the peace nodded at the word the way men nod when their supper depends upon it. If a poor boy needed placing, Nathaniel had a pen. If a widow missed her tithe and her child required care, Nathaniel knew a man upriver with room in his sheds. If a black man freed by the last owner could not prove his paper at sundown, Nathaniel had a notice in a drawer that could make a man owned again without anybody raising a fuss louder than a stovepipe will carry. He loved the way paper obeyed him. He loved the way doors did too. The house had learned under his hand to put its iron where he liked it. Bolts faced in on the pantry because sugar, he said, walked on small feet. On the little room off the kitchen where heat gathered winter and summer both. On the back stair where the older girl favored slipping down when the night felt kinder than day. He called it prudence. The hinges called it by the sound they made when a latch meets a seat it never should have learned. His wife, Temperance, moved through rooms like someone measuring out grief from a jar. Still, precise, unwilling to spill. The daughters were Ruth, 17 and long in the face like her mother with a jaw that understood keeping still, and Liddy, 14, quick at cipher and quicker at swallowing words before they got her in the sort of trouble girls get in when men fancy themselves arithmetic. There was a boy, Thomas, 10 and narrow, who learned to carry wood with his shoulders up near his ears, as if listening could keep him from erring. In the backyard beyond the kitchen, 3 black hands kept the place working: Moses, near 40 and silent as a cypress; Charity, who could coax bread out of a flour barrel that had argued with other women; and June, a girl not yet 20 whose right wrist carried a scar shaped like someone else's name. Nathaniel liked to speak of law when he set his pen to blue. The poor law allowed parish children to be bound to suitable households where industry might be taught. Guardianship papers kept widows from managing beyond sense. Apprenticeship indentures properly witnessed made a boy a tool for 7 years and the man who held him a craftsman by virtue of ownership alone. And then there were notes, stamped by the county clerk, that could turn a winter's credit to a spring's foreclosure if a man's luck didn't fit the book's numbers. Nathaniel folded all that into his quiet account and called it order. Men who slept well called it the same. He kept a clock's eye on the bell rope in the hall. At dawn it asked folks to come to table, and at dusk it asked God to look away while the house counted itself. He had locked the little door to that rope for years now, not because the rope needed guarding, but because the notion of a thing that could call the whole yard to attention without blessing of his hand had set a pebble under his tongue that he could not spit. He carried the key in his waistcoat like a proof. He drank little and never in daylight. Such men often do not. His comfort arrived at his hand by pen stroke, by hinge and latch. When temper rose, and it did, at hours the house learned to fear, he did not shout. He took the quiet ledger and straightened it as if a crooked page were an affront to decency. and then he wrote something tidy that injured the breathing without raising the room. He found Liddy's sums neat long before he discovered their danger. She could hold a measure of wheat in her head and divide it by mouths with an ease that would shame a man with a school behind him. That would not do. He reduced her evenings at the table under the lamp and gave her afternoons in the small heat room, helping Charity mind the loaves. The upper bolt learned to slide without squeal. The lower bolt learned to sit without seat. His hand knew how to make iron obey the wrong law with a lightness that sounded like kindness if you weren't being closed in by it. Willis Trammell from the vestry came with a paper one morning, poor house mark on it, and a seal gone flat from too many thumbs. A woman dead of fever had left behind a boy, 7, and a girl near Liddy's age. The parish preferred not to feed. Nathaniel took the page and set it on the desk and looked at the light the way a man poses for gratitude. He said the boy could be put to useful apprenticeship with the cooper 3 miles north. He wrote the girl's name in blue under placement and made the mark beside it that meant to him, "Recovers my neighbor's debt if placed well." He did not call it selling. He called it prudence again, and the word became a sort of oil he rubbed into everything that needed to slip past the conscience. Ruth watched the page go under his hand and learned a new way to be still. She had been born into a room that rewarded smallness, but there are kinds of smallness that deform and kinds that wait. She waited, but the waiting made a hum under her breastbone that kept her from sleeping if the wind came right from the bay and rattled the little panes in the back hall. Charity watched the warm closet door. She knew wood like she knew dough. A door learns a hand the way a loaf learns a baker. In time it will rise for one and not for another. When Nathaniel slid the upper iron, the board answered with the little groan of a woman asked to carry a weight she had not consented to. When he slid the lower, the sound went smaller, like someone being quiet to save somebody else from waking. Charity pressed her palm once to the panel after he left, just a touch to tell the door somebody still knew the right name for it. Moses counted steps. He had learned to keep track of the world by where feet go and when. His feet found the kitchen when Charity's hand hurt, and he took a pan without asking and did not burn the bread. His feet found the path from the coop to the pump without marking the ground too much for Nathaniel to notice, because men like that notice ground when it misbehaves. His feet found the corner of the porch where the bell-rope door could be seen without being looked at, and he stood sometimes as if admiring the road while counting who carried keys in their waistcoats. Nathaniel's quiet accounts grew brisk in late spring when rain stopped sulking, and the geese laid foolish and fat by the marsh. He wrote arrear beside 3 names, men who had bought salt and hoped fishing would love them enough to pay it back. He wrote security beside a widow's name, Temperance's cousin, Eliza, who had come back to live tight because her husband had taken his foolishness to Norfolk and not returned. He wrote indenture beside the poorhouse boy, meaning to make a craftsman into a number that would like him better. He wrote placement beside the poorhouse girl, meaning to teach Liddy a lesson if she noticed. He wrote recovery beside Moses when a neighbor with too much whiskey and too little fence began making noises about a man he did not own who had looked at him steadily over a post. Paper finds ways to make looking a crime when a man with ink gets jealous of looking's courage. The justice of the peace rode out in a good coat with a bad conscience and took coffee and left with 2 neat bundles of paper and a story about parish duty. He shook Nathaniel's hand in the yard and told him he appreciated the way things were kept in order under this roof. Temperance heard the word fall and hit the stones by the stoop and make no sound at all. By June, the summer machine had taught itself to run, yard, field, table, room, and all the parts did what they had been meant to do if you asked a man with the quiet ledger. Liddy made her sums in her head for nobody. Ruth learned to count the number of breaths it takes for a bolt to slide if the hand on it is not angry yet. Thomas learned to draw the bell-rope door with a stick in the dust behind the pump, and then to scuff it out with his heel before a man's eye came near. Charity took slivers of tallow and pressed them into hinges with a tenderness that did the door no good, but kept her sane. Moses learned the taste of the day by the sound of the first set of boots on the gallery, the light half-step of a clerk, the solid little music of the justice, the hush of Nathaniel Ashe, who believed silence could be weapon and blessing both if put in the proper ledger. The first little harm came as they often do, dressed as tidying. Nathaniel found Liddy in the front room with a borrowed almanac and her finger on a table that told tides and moons. He took the book gently from her hand and set it aside. He told her to fetch flour. He slid the warm closet bolt when she went in and listened to her breath alter, not because he wanted to hear it, but because hearing proved that he had not become less powerful than the door. He gave her 5 minutes and then 7, for lesson, he said to nobody. The room held onto her breath after, for a while, the way a house will when it's been required to keep a secret. The second harm wore church clothes. On a Sunday afternoon, he called Ruth to the desk and asked her to copy out a line from a psalm in the fair hand she had learned from her mother, because even careful men like to admire what they own in a light that flatters them. She copied the line. He dictated a second, and it was not scripture. It was a consent clause for guardianship. Mild language, proper words, a tone no louder than polite company. She copied, hands steady, because copying instructs the world how to excuse itself. He blotted the page and set it by to dry with the contented little sigh of a man whose house had performed his will without making a scene. Temperance watched from the doorway with her mouth turned in at the corners to keep from making any noise the door might feel obliged to swallow. There is a point in a year when the bay sets a skin over itself, and the insects test it with their wings the way girls test rules with eyes, not hands. Mosquitoes woke. Heat lay down in the hallway and pretended to be a rug. Charity hung sprigs of tansy and kept the child Thomas swinging the fan idly near the dough while she counted under breath. Moses laid eel traps in the small creek and did not resent the eels for reminding him that slipping is what keeps a thing alive some days. Nathaniel adjusted a hinge on the bell-rope door himself. It had begun to catch, and told Temperance that a man ought to tend his own doors, else the house might forget who has the right to open and shut it. On an evening green with storm, the parish carter rattled up with the poorhouse boy and the poorhouse girl on the board behind, both with eyes like creatures taught not to look men full in the face. The boy took to Moses quick, men knowing one another's quiet. The girl took to Ruth as girls do when the room smells like bread and the woman in it does not say much. Nathaniel put the parish paper on the desk and lined up the edges with the ledger so the two documents would confer. He put a mark in the quiet book that meant soon, a little hook of ink that pleased him. They ate. The storm hit. The bell in the hall knocked its tongue once against the cup in the steeple where it lived, and the little sound ran down the rope and slept behind the door where the key in Nathaniel's waistcoat kept it from escaping. After bread, the room resumed the hush it was used to. Thomas, too happy from bread to fret, played a hand game with the poorhouse boy under the table and learned without instruction what it means to keep a rhythm, even when the big people in a room have decided to forget it exists. Night made the sort of clamp on the place that makes breath feel like work. Nathaniel took the parish paper folded and set it under the blotter. He set the quiet ledger on top like propriety covering need. He took the key from his waistcoat and turned the bell-rope door to be sure the little cupboard remembered its manners. He checked the warm closet bolts and let the upper one sing its scratch of obedience, and the lower one sit into its new false home with the faintest suggestion of sound, enough to make him feel godly, not enough to trouble anyone else. He slept like men who have no imagination sleep. Temperance did not. She lay on her side and listened to the kitchen cool and the poorhouse girl turn, and Charity's hand settle finally quiet on her own stomach after a day of lifting iron that thinks it is lighter than it is. She listened for an animal that had not made itself known in their yard for 2 years. She heard nothing but the small talk of boards, and then a thin something that might have been the bell rope in the hall moving under its own sense of weather. In the morning, the justice came again in his coat, and this time his pen hunted something small, a witness mark on a guardianship clause, a seal on an apprenticeship paper. He sat, he nodded, he remarked on the weather. He touched the bell rope door idly and remarked it kept young hands from mischief. He did not notice Charity's face when he said the phrase suitable household. He wrote in black what Nathaniel had already written in blue. and in the writing added weight to a thing that already had too much. The plan was small as a seed. The poorhouse girl, placed, with a weaver's wife 2 counties north before harvest. Liddy visited that same house for instruction in the economy of a proper home. The weaver's wife had sons and no daughters, preference for cowed girls, and a husband who drank ink as well as spirits whenever a parish paper let him. The sum of it looked like grace to any man whose dinner was set by someone else. Nathaniel liked to set his pen near such grace and make a little flourish. Liddy found the paper under the blotter not because she went hunting, but because she had a habit of dusting for temperance after supper in the front room with a care that reflected light back at the desk until the desk could not hold it all. She did not read the whole. Girls rarely do. She read enough to move breath into a new part of her chest she had not used. She put the blotter back. She aligned the edges. She lifted the cloth from the bell rope door and put it back, a gesture like prayer. She went to the warm closet and put her hand on the panel where the lower bolt sat in false friendship with its plate, and felt, through the wood, that Charity and Moses had both found this same spot in the night at different hours, and left in it a little warmth that did not belong to the stove. Nathaniel watched the room not from malice alone, but from the vigilance of a man who fears his papers might not hold if anyone laughed loudly enough. He tightened his mouth when laughter rose. He flagged his hand when stillness went on too long without manly explanation. He set Ruth to copy more scripture and more sentences that were not scripture until her hand cramped, and he said, "Good. A girl should have a trained hand." He told Temperance to call on Eliza and remind her how cousins guard one another. He told Moses to measure the north fence and bring him the number of rails needed. He told Charity to turn the loaves at the quarter hour instead of the half because heat had gotten uppity. He told June to fetch water and not linger with the boy under the elm. He told Thomas to stop drawing the little square that he drew. He told the bell to learn silence. The house tried. It swallowed the sound of Ruth's hand, then coughed it back out. It swallowed the sound of Liddy's breath in the warm closet and could not keep it. It swallowed the sound of Charity and Charity's name and nearly choked on it. Some houses are not built for this kind of obedient digestion. They can be trained to take it for a while. Then they spit. 2 nights before the parish cart was to return for the poorhouse girl and to carry the visitor along for instruction, the bell in the steeple gave one low note without help, the kind of sound iron makes when weather and wood agree that something has been held too long and deserves a word. It went down the rope to the little door in the hall and met the key in Nathaniel's waistcoat with a soft, honest thud. It woke Thomas. It woke the poorhouse boy. It woke Temperance from the edge of sleep and set her on her elbow to listen. It did not wake Nathaniel. Men who write enough blue on paper can sleep under a bell like that and call themselves right. In the dark that followed, the warm closet shelf above the stovepipe clicked once, the sound wood makes when it gives a fraction to a day it has no appetite for. Charity sat up on her pallet and put her hand to her stomach because girls in such houses learn to keep their insides still any way they can. Moses, at the back step, kept counting in his head and changed from rails to breaths without losing the sum. Ruth lay with her eyes open and saw in the ceiling the columns of the quiet ledger, and she added one line to the bottom, in her mind, with a neat hand. Reckoning, she wrote there, a word girls ought not know and sometimes must. Dawn came damp. Nathaniel stood, set his vest right, checked the rope door, checked the warm closet, adjusted the blotter. He set his hand on the quiet ledger as if reading an oath without moving his lips. He told the house by touch that the day would belong to him, and the house, having listened to him too long, prepared itself to disagree. The day set about its work as if a man had wound it. Hen on the rail, wind up from the bay only enough to move shirts on the line, the stove's first breath measured, then hidden. Nathaniel Ashe stood at his desk and looked as a man does when he has already answered the questions he plans to ask. He touched the quiet ledger, then the parish paper, then the little key in his waistcoat that kept the bell rope from taking liberties. The room kept his hands sequenced the way a child keeps a rhyme. He wrote 3 words in blue under the line that bore the poorhouse girl's name: suitable, witnessed, placed. He added a mark beside Liddy's name that meant what his mouth would never say. Tested, likely, agreeable. The ink looked innocent sitting there, the way docile animals look in spring before men begin to talk about their use. Temperance lit the lamp out of habit, though daylight made it unnecessary. She had learned that certain gestures keep a house from getting angry by having a job to do. She watched him from the doorway with the tired steadiness of women who have outlived romance and been assigned prudence as if it were a dowry. Moses squared the north fence count in his head and set it against the rails he knew from touch, not tally. He thought about the measure of a door instead, the way a man will when numbers become to him a way of telling truth to himself, without a mouth. He had learned that the lower bolt on the warm closet sat into a house that was no longer certain of its obedience. That knowledge stayed at his fingertips, ready. Charity baked with a pace that made heat glance off her instead of climb inside. She gave June the task of fetching water not because June needed practice, but because water keeps a girl out of a room where the quiet is heavy enough to break delicate bones. Ruth took up the copy pen again without a look from anybody. She set down 2 lines the vestry had asked for and 3 more Nathaniel had suggested. Phrases about refinements and female economy and advantage accruing to character by residence elsewhere. She did not use the word removal. Girls like Ruth put that word under their tongue and hold it until a better name offers itself. Liddy washed 2 bowls and listened for the way the warm closet hinged. She timed her breath when she walked by it the way a person will when passing a sleeping dog owned by a man too proud of his animal. Thomas played the counting game with the poorhouse boy under the stoop until the 2 of them could clap a pattern without looking at each other. He learned the shapes of men's boots by ear, Nathaniel's hush, the justice's particular creak, the vestryman's mindless tap. Before noon, the justice returned with a seal he had warmed at the meeting-house stove and a pen that wrote black in strokes he had been praised for when young. He put down a courtesy for Temperance and sat. Nathaniel spread the parish page with the pastoral flourish of a man laying out a communion cloth. They spoke softly of burdens and distinctions, the way men in decent coats have always made theft into philosophy. Only so that the child may be offered improvement, the justice said, not for Nathaniel's sake, who did not require persuasion, but under the eye of the house, which had begun to listen and had not decided how it meant to judge. Nathaniel nodded. The sound his throat made reminded Ruth of the bell's tongue when a storm takes its time deciding the pitch of its patience. Witnesses came in pairs, as law prefers. Willis Trammell from the vestry, and Hubert Cole, who owned 2 fields and a store, and liked to pretend the store excused him from being a farmer. They stood in the door signed where the justice tapped, and looked at Liddy only as long as it took to find reassurance in her lowered eyes. If they had looked longer, they might have seen the arithmetic setting up behind her face, columns of harm and consequence and a sum that would not be entered into Nathaniel's book no matter how neat his hand. The placement letter for the poorhouse boy rode off under the cooper's apprentice mark. Moses watched the cart go and did not press his tongue against his teeth the way he would have if it were Sunday, for fear of making a sound the house would be asked to eat. The poorhouse girl stayed. She kept to the corners where women moving bowls and the fan could see her. When she laughed once at Thomas's rabbit on the board, Ruth put a hand on the girl's shoulder as if to pin that small sound down where the door could not swallow it. Nathaniel slid the warm closet bolt on Liddy that afternoon at 3:05. He timed that sort of thing so the habit would become a sentence. He stood and listened to the quiet like a doctor to a patient he does not love. He looked at Temperance, who folded a cloth twice. At Charity, who pressed a hand against the bread's belly. At Ruth, who kept her eyes where scripture ought to be. He wanted to hear the house admit him again. He wanted to hear it pop the little submission it had learned for him. He received something else. A thickness as if the air had taken one breath, and held it to see what a man would do with a room that refused to respond. He opened the door 7 minutes later and called it discipline. He offered Liddy a slice of bread and called it balance. He turned the lower bolt with 2 fingers and decided it had behaved. That is the sort of conclusion men reach when they believe doors honor papers. He drafted another page for the quiet book and smiled into a dip in the paper where his pen caught. He wrote, "Eliza Ash, security outstanding, collateral, Ruth's hand copy for debt." It pleased him to convert two women into a debt conversation that would pay a coal delivery pure beyond survival. He closed the book and laid the blotter square and went to his bell-rope door and turned the key back and forth twice as if the iron needed reassurance. At supper, Temperance asked Eliza to stay the night so the cousins could arrange for an errand to town in the morning. The errand would be to the justice for nothing official, and to the clerk for nothing he would sign. The errand would be to the store for thread, and to the road for a look at the world beyond the length of the gallery. Nathaniel approved. He believed night makes debt easy for a man brave enough to write it under his own roof. He believed day makes it inescapable for everyone else. He allowed Eliza to stay as if granting a right. After bread and stew, Moses came to the stoop to put oil on the front door hinge. He moved to the bell-rope door without being told, and put 2 fingers there too, a polite pretense of service. The little cupboard recognized the touch and did not move. Iron sometimes shows preferences and pretends it's just weather. He watched the key stir in the waistcoat pocket and settle. He watched Ruth fold the cloth where the blotter had been and set it on the back of the chair. He watched Liddy stand between warm closet and desk with her hands at her sides, the way a saint does in a painting, when the painter has been paid to write the Saint Modest. There is a rhythm to men who like documents. They prefer anniversaries of their own designs. Nathaniel told Temperance that the cart would arrive 2 mornings hence. He told the justice to return tomorrow afternoon for final witness. He told Trammell to bring the vestry book in case any small-town kindness felt it needed to be recorded beside the essentials. He told Moses to go early to the fence and to be back exactly on time with the number, not the rails. He told Charity to mind heat. He told June to keep to shade. He told Ruth to write her hand the way a lady does when she thinks nobody prints as more fair. He told the room to behave. It behaved until midnight. In that hour, boards remembered trees, and trees remembered wind, and wind remembered water, and water remembered the low holler wood makes when men have convinced it to forget how to sing. The bell in the steeple, unsettled by nothing but the house's own shift against itself, made a round sound without malice. It rolled down the rope and kissed the little cupboard door and went into the keyhole, and turned the air on the other side until the iron noticed it was being talked to. Temperance sat up and whispered nothing. She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her palm to the kitchen jamb and felt the house breathe into her hand like a child. Then stop. Then take another breath. Because breath is irritable when the day has asked too much. She stood until the heat in her palm matched the wood. She returned to bed and lay without closing her eyes. Eliza, on the settle, opened hers and kept them open. She had not expected sympathy to invite itself. It slid in and sat anyway. She decided to carry it like a plate fresh from the oven, not because she loved heat, but because letting it fall would load the same work on another woman's hands. Charity went to the warm closet and pressed 2 fingers to the lower bolt seat through the panel, and the iron behaved shamefully. It warmed at her finger's attention, the way a dog does that should guard but loves instead. She withdrew. She set the bread to rise. She put the tin of grease back in its little place near the pipe shelf and did not look at it again, because looking names a plan too early. Ruth drifted into the room with the desk and stood near as if she had been told to, and she had, by the sound a page makes when it dries and pulls back from the blotter, a little sigh men miss and girls hear across hallways when they are meant to be sleeping. She lifted the cloth and set it aside and put her hand flat on the margin of the quiet ledger. She did not read. She left her palm oil there without making a show of it. She placed it where his thumb had loved to seat itself. She registered the warmth of possession and returned it with a temperature of her own. She drew back and did not wipe her hand on her skirt as decency would have called for. She let the oil remain. She wanted the room to remember that without writing permission, a girl had been here. The next day at 10, Nathaniel found nothing amiss because men like him are not taught how to see under the surface of things even when they fetishize surface. He set his thumb where her palm print had been and could not call what he felt betrayal, because he had never met it in his own skin before. He told himself the house needed more attention. He adjusted the latch on the warm closet again, though it did not call for him. He opened the rope door and closed it again and pocketed the key with the profound relief superstition gives a man who does not believe he is superstitious. Willis Trammell returned with the vestry book and a satisfied smile he wore when good order looked like God had agreed with him in writing. He told Ruth to make a neat copy of a new phrase the vestry had chosen for the instruction of certain girls in proper homes. He wanted it to sound less like moving meat. She wrote the line with the speed of someone who did not need more practice at writing things she despised. She allowed her hand to falter on one letter that would change nothing. She thrilled at this little treason and then hated herself for taking so little when so much waited for better theft. The justice set the seal, and the clerk, young Mallory, sent as a favor from town because the older men said his handwriting made them believe in order, wrote the witnessing line and felt in his wrist a small ache that warned him his arm would be more honest soon than he had planned for. He set the book to dry. He pinched a corner to test it and left a print too faint to scandalize a judge and too clear to be completely explained. The poorhouse girl shadowed Liddy all morning, the way women tie their breath together on purpose before a descent. She held the fan when Liddy moved the bread. When Liddy set the fan down, the girl took up a cloth and dusted the bell-rope door without touching it, for fear that iron remembers offense better than kindness. Charity smiled into the bowl. She liked watching two girls teach each other small tasks as if they were writing the day down in a language the house had forgotten, but could be taught to read again. By afternoon, the heat had fallen and gotten up twice. Nathaniel's mouth had set into the line it wears when he believes argument to be an impiety. He told Temperance the cart would arrive earlier than he'd thought. He told Ruth to fetch the paper with the seal and bring the blotter too, a minor triumph that made Ruth want to press her teeth into her lip until blood could feel its way into her own mouth and remind her that bodies, not papers, run the world when the hour grows honest. She brought the paper, set it down, and left a clean place where the palm print had been. She knew he would think the clean place his own doing. She walked backward out of the room, as if obeying some minor court rule, and pressed a hand to the kitchen jamb when no one looked. Nathaniel went to the warm closet to perform the ceremony of small dominion that justifies men to themselves when they must look God in the mouth later. 7 minutes will clean a soul that used a door, he believed. He slid the upper bolt with the seat sound. He slid the lower into the false home that had learned not to squeal. He stood still, and the house stood with him and let him measure its breath. He opened the door and nothing moved except air. He carried deeply into himself the sense that iron had confessed their relationship renewed. He missed the way the shelf above the pipe had shifted just enough to remember Charity's fingers. In the yard, the cart appeared. It came not as a surprise. Those conveyances rarely do. Its rattling threaded through the lane's dust with all the indifference of a system that prides itself on consistency. The Cooper's man from yesterday nodded to Moses and let his eyes fall, because he was, after all, not the sort meant to witness anything beyond his day's appointment. Nathaniel set the paper on the desk and put his thumb to the seal to feel the authority he liked to relearn even when he had himself taught it to others. He straightened his vest. He called, not loudly, for Liddy and for the poorhouse girl. Temperance fixed her gaze on the yard where a gull had come too far inland and was offended by everything it saw. She could relate. When the girls did not appear, he told Ruth to fetch them. Ruth did not move. He told her again. She moved like a woman whose limbs are accountable only to decency, not to fear. She went to the kitchen and stood, not in the door, but where the stove's breath would keep a person honest. Charity lifted the tin of grease, not because she needed it, because her hand wanted something to hold that would not go to paper if she squeezed too hard. Moses stood on the porch step, as if he had miscounted rails and needed to try again. He put the heel of his right hand against the jamb under the latch the way a man does when he intends to lean but will not till given a sign. The poorhouse girl came out from under the long table and looked at Charity first, then at Ruth, then at the back of Liddy's head. Liddy turned with her mouth set the way Ruth's did when she read law out loud. and found herself reading Hunger instead. The two girls took each other's hands as if playing at a wedding. Nathaniel appeared in the door with the seal paper and the little mouth he reserves for blessings he does not mean. He lifted his hand, and the house, which had been trained too well, made ready to hold its breath for another man's satisfaction. But the little cupboard in the hall where the bell rope sleeps took a swallow of air under its own authority, and exhaled it with a sound that should have embarrassed iron. The rope moved. The bell did not ring. The key in the waistcoat pocket turned against Nathaniel's ribs and made his heart notice it was a tool like any other muscle. Temperance looked at the waistcoat pocket, not her husband's face, because sometimes a woman cannot meet a man at his best or worst for fear she will let slip the one word that ends a house. She looked at the pocket and decided to rearrange the day into a shape that would not require either of them to say something unforgivable. She spoke to Eliza without moving her mouth. Now. Eliza went to the desk and took the blotter cloth and placed it over the parish page as if a fly had landed and needed to be discouraged. She pressed her palm through the cloth so that the seal attached more to her hand than to the paper. She lifted her palm and left a pressure that did nothing to the law and everything to the room. Nathaniel turned to her, as if she had ruined a Monday with an untidy act. He looked at the cloth and at the paper and at Ruth, who held Liddy and the poorhouse girl in a line. Admiration would have made a poem out of if men did not hate women's bodies lined up against their paperwork. He walked toward them, not fast exactly, but with the stride of a man who sees his reflection move against him in a glass and blames the glass. Moses put his hand against the jamb, now with intention. Charity set the tin on the shelf and pressed her fingers flat to the panel where the lower bolt nested in false home and found, not iron, not wood, but that crevice between the two where a woman's insistence fits without being invited. The cart rattled under the window and then stopped because a wheel had found a stone that nobody had moved. The cooper's boy turned in his seat and looked at the bird inland and laughed because a gull angry in a yard is the sort of mercy God gives you when a week's work has made you stupid with hope. Nathaniel set his thumb on the seal again, perhaps for luck. He opened his mouth to speak a word he had saved for just this sort of moment, duty, but the room could not swallow it. The stove let out a breath at the wrong time. The bell rope door sighed. The lower bolt in the warm closet moved under Charity's hand, not towards seat or away from it, but into the precise position where a child can push and make a thought come true. Liddy put her palm to the panel at shoulder height where the wood remembers hands. She pressed. The door swung inward, then back, then inward again until the jamb, surprised, gave. It crossed the floor with a little racket that announced not rebellion exactly, but a failure of obedience the house had been building toward all summer. The poorhouse girl reached for Liddy's sleeve and stepped through. Ruth put her body in the space where a paper had imagined there would be neat procession of children into a cart. Nathaniel stopped. The house, which had promised him so much, held him at that distance and did not give him his customary concession of silence. The water in June's bucket sloshed against the rim and did not apologize. Temperance put her hand on the bell rope door, not the key, and left it there. Moses shut his eyes and opened them, and found in the doorway the sort of arithmetic that settles a sum without anyone needing to write it down. Girls, door, woman, man, room, rope. The justice, late by a kindness he had not planned, stepped onto the gallery and saw a scene that would require more of him than witness. He looked first at the paper to save his habits and did not find comfort there. He looked at the rope door and thought of weather and rings and wives on porches living through men's ideas. He looked at Ruth with her hand on Liddy's arm, and at the poorhouse girl and at Charity's fingers still flat to wood, and at Moses's palm under the latch and at Temperance resting her hand on a cupboard that had learned to become a judge. He closed his book. Nathaniel frowned into the space between himself and the new shape of his house. He set the paper down as if someone had more properly earned it. He touched his waistcoat where the key had pressed, and found the pressure had made a little bruise of his own making. He did not recognize the mark for what it was. He reached for the handle of the warm closet door with an eagerness he had never wasted on women. He intended to put something back in. The handle met his palm and felt like a throat. He paused because a man raised to call his own sense law will pause when Wood insists on speaking in tongues he had thought below it. He looked at Temperance, who did not look at him. He looked at Ruth, who did. He looked at the poorhouse girl, who put her hand behind her back and took Liddy's fingers as if there were nothing else to do. The justice said nothing helpful. He stood and did not leave. The cart horse stamped, the way horses do when a day goes on too long without choosing. The gull dropped something in the yard. A person could not be blamed for calling a sign if a person believed in such inventions. The house breathed. It did not swallow. It blew that breath back into men's faces. Nathaniel's mouth made the word duty again and failed to project it across the new distance Law had to travel. He set his thumb on the seal to steady himself, like a man on a dock touching a post because the boat insists on telling him which way is forward. He did not know it, but when his thumb came up, the wax carried a bit of him with it and would not soon be persuaded to let it go. Temperance said now without moving her mouth. The word arrived at Charity's palm through Wood. Charity moved the lower bolt outward the breadth of a nail. Moses took his hand from the jamb and put it on the latch and set it to face the road. That small rearrangement did not yet end a man. It ended the kind of day documents can survive untouched. It ended the lesson that had instructed the room to be an engine. It began the kind of hour in which the bell waits for an honest hand, and a girl learns that a door might consent to learn a different direction if asked with respect by fingers that bake for it. The justice turned his face toward town as if fresh air had been minted there. He lifted his hand to the brim of his hat and did not remove it. He whispered a thing that might have been an apology to God or to the house or to women he had not married, or to children whose names he had believed himself allowed to copy. He failed to resolve which. Nathaniel took one step backward, not out of fear, but because the floor under his foot had the angle of a ship the first time a man realizes he has set out and cannot immediately return. He looked behind him and found the bell-rope door, little and unthreatening, a piece of architecture men put their backs to when they need to pretend they invented shelter. He felt the key press again and thought of removing his vest and decided to keep to a costume that had thus far excused him. In the corner near the stove, Thomas, whose business all along had been to notice how things moved, folded his hands and did not clap. The poorhouse boy stood beside him and put his hand on the rabbit chalked earlier in the day and erased only the ear. The rabbit remained a rabbit. It could still hear. Out in the lane, the cooper's boy asked the horse for the courtesy of patience, and the horse agreed the way horses do, by taking one breath that sounds like a man's last and blowing it onto the earth like a blessing for dirt. The cart would wait. Inside, a page on the desk that felt itself important began to curl at one corner where the cloth had been placed too long. The quiet ledger under it held a print in oil and did not know whether to be grateful. The ink on the new line did not dry as clean as its predecessors, because air has a habit of inserting itself into arrangements men think sealed. The house refused to swallow any of it. It let the sound stay, the stove's breath, the bell's small, unreasonable sigh, a girl's knuckles against a door panel, a woman's palm finding the place where lower iron translates insistence into motion, a man's mouth making a word too light for this kind of heat. In the intimacy of those sounds, a sum finished adding itself in places no man's pen could reach. The moral fracture did not arrive with screaming. It arrived like a room deciding what it will have been when someone writes its history, engine or house. The morning wore blue like a bruise, a fainting of color that told the bay had slept bad and meant to be short with anybody not minding their own. The cart waited in the lane with the patience of tools, and the horse stamped once and then again as if to mark the hour on dirt. Inside, wax curled at one corner of the seal where the blotter had been kind longer than law would prefer, and the quiet ledger held a palm in oil it could not admit to in any language Nathaniel recognized. He straightened papers with the fastidiousness that keeps weak men upright, and checked again the little cupboard that kept the bell rope penned. The key in his waistcoat found the same rib and made the same small ache he told himself was age. He touched it, eased it, and thought better of comfort in front of other people's breath. The plan in the house had been written without ink. Temperance's wakefulness had found Ruth's stillness and Charity's palm, and Moses's hand and Liddy's shoulder. Their arrangement required no oaths beyond the ones a room can keep. It asked only for timing, iron at one hinge, rope at another, and a breath held until boards remembered pine. Before noon, the justice appeared with his good book, and the self-regard men tend to assume when their hats are brushed. The young clerk, Mallory, came behind him with a pen he carried like a conscience and eyes that looked too long at the desk before he remembered the lesson about where to rest them. Willis Trammell arrived last with his vestry volume and his inward certainty that God favored careful records. They took the shade of the gallery, as if they had been invited into coolness by name. Nathaniel laid the parish paper on the desk with the pastoral air of a man blessing something not his. He set his thumb on the seal and felt it stick, a petty discomfort that did not alter his belief in surfaces. He called up the names that would prove the day had been arranged in order, and the house, at that word, grew still enough to be heard thinking. Temperance moved first, or perhaps the house did under her palm. She crossed to the little cupboard and set her hand on its skin of wood as if greeting a child who might bolt. Iron remembered her and had the decency to creak, a sound small enough to be called weather if a man needed that excuse later. The latch's mouth lifted. The key in the waistcoat pocket grew foolish, a leftover argument nobody intended to revisit in public. Charity pressed her fingers to the warm closet panel where lower iron had been taught to lie. The seam accepted her insistence and loosened its bad manners just enough to be ready. Moses took the jam under the latch with a hand set to nudge a fact into law when the moment asked. Ruth stood between desk and door, the poorhouse girl at her elbow and Liddy at her wrist, bodies arranged like a sentence grammar requires when truth will not bear witness to itself. Nathaniel reached for the handle of the small door, as a man will test a gate he is taught to behave. He found it ajar under his wife's palm, and did not at once register the insult. He looked to the desk to make sure paper had not noticed. He glanced at the justice to steady his image in another man's eyes. He did not see the little hinge consent to a better use. Ruth lifted the rope, not high, not hard, just enough to teach iron the shape of the sound it would be required to make. The bell in the steeple took the lesson in one breath and gave it back, low and honest, as if speaking into a collarbone. The note traveled down into the hallway and sat in the air without permission to leave. The rope asked again. The bell answered with a voice that belonged to the yard more than to any man standing in it. The horse outside raised its head. The cartwheels shifted of their own weight and found a shallow rut men had made of days like these. Mallory's hand stuttered on his pen and did not break the nib. The justice inclined his head toward the sound as if that might call it gentle. Willis Trammell put his palm to his book and remembered nothing he had ever written in it. Nathaniel moved for the ladder at the bell cupboard with the indignation a man reserves for inanimate objects that forget who feeds them. He set his foot on the rung and found, under his heel, a smear of something that made his boot uncertain. Wax, a kindness gone rogue. He kept climbing because men write courage in their heads when pride wants its due. He set his hand to a rung and found wood that had softened in summer and not been offered repair because documents had kept the family dutifully distracted. Ruth pulled again, and the bell took to the work with a seriousness no one had expected, putting shoulder into air. The second note made tidy notions in the room look silly. The third reached the lane. The fourth, softer, folded itself around the cart and lay against the horse's back like a breeze. Temperance stayed at the rope without looking at it. She had learned to keep company with necessary things without romanticizing them. She listened to the iron's tongue and let it say once what a woman is never permitted to pronounce out loud, in company without paying for it later. Nathaniel reached the little square at the top and took hold of the rope with both hands the way he would take a child who was too forgiving and make it behave. He pulled to silence it, but the pull became a knot in his arms that taught him a lesson he had paid other bodies to learn for him. He did not fall then. The house would not cheapen itself with spectacle. It made him step wrong. It made him have to sit on a brace to find his breath. It held him there with his back against a board he had never touched except to order it moved. Below, the justice stood where a man stands when he cannot tell if he is present at law or at the end of one. He looked at the parish paper and saw not the seal, but the mark the cloth had made when Eliza pressed through mercy. He looked at Ruth's hand and saw that a girl's body had written a sentence he would be asked to sign. He looked at Mallory and found in the young man's face the affront of a person who has discovered the wrist has a say in what the hand will and will not do. Charity slipped the lower bolt on the warm closet outward with enough ease to instruct a future. Moses turned the latch to face the road and let it sit. He did not push the door. He let the door choose. It opened with the relief of a back that has lived too long under a load. The poorhouse girl, who had once been written as placeable, stepped into the hall and regarded the cupboard where rope lives with the respect a person gives a well. She did not reach for it. She stood where Ruth had put her and became the specific child the parish paper had not wanted to conjure. Liddy, drawn by the sound of iron behaving, placed her palm on the jamb of the warm closet and found it warm as another woman's breath. She smiled with only one corner of her mouth, a compromise with happiness she would allow herself for now. Nathaniel, dumbfounded by architecture, descended. He wiped his waxed heel on the ladder rung without looking down and left a pail that would, later, teach someone else a lesson in humility. He stepped into the hall with a face damp at the temples, the kind of mark men call weather. He put a hand to his waistcoat to reassure himself the key still lived where he kept his authority. He found the little bruise bigger. He refused to understand. He reached for the parish paper as if it could assert him. Mallory placed his pen across it, a humble bar. He had not earned this bravery via philosophy. He had been given it by the sound of a bell. He lifted the quiet ledger from beneath with two hands that had written men into and out of trouble on other days, and felt proper weight in paper for the first time since he had learned his letters. He carried it to the porch rail and set it where shade would let the oil speak. He opened to Ruth's palm and Nathaniel's thumb, and held the book like a thing that had been kissed and ought to be reconciled. The justice did the one decent act available to him without insult to the truth. He did not seize anything, he did not destroy. He closed the parish paper gently between his palms and held it as if it had a fever and might benefit from waiting. He put it on the desk and spread the blotter over it and left his hand there, not to hide, to care. He stepped back. Willis Trammell stood between the habit he called Providence and the sound that had called him out of it. He set his vestry book on the chair and made no effort to read from it. He took a breath that displeased God and delighted the human beings in the room. Nathaniel took a step toward the girls because that is a direction the day had always obeyed. Moses stepped between the man and the space and did nothing more than exist there in the shape of a person whose day will no longer be counted in another's book. He did not touch Nathaniel. He did not speak. He moved forward, just enough to teach the room where a future stood. Temperance, hand to the rope, did not lift again. The bell had said enough. She let it hang with its memory. She took the tin of grease from the shelf where Charity had left it and put it on the desk beside the parish paper. A kindness she could hold had been placed next to a justice she could not. That was honest inventory. Nathaniel set his thumb to the seal once more out of spite, and the wax held skin. He made a face, like a person puzzled by the sensation of being read against. He removed his thumb, saw the mark he had made on the thing he meant to brand the world with, and recoiled from the simple proof that he was, in fact, merely another man and not a species of law. He sat, not because his pride had learned, but because knees answer physics, not documents. On the chair with the vestry book, he left sweat he would not be able to call Charity. He looked at his daughters and found a sentence that did not involve his pen, that the person who has kept you compliant can be turned into an object a room keeps out of pity. The cart waited. The horse blinked flies out of its eyes. The gull stalked, offended by nothing in particular now that the bell had completed its thought. The day deepened its color and postponed heat without commitment. The justice cleared his throat and did the work he had not intended to do that morning. He gathered the parish paper and the quiet ledger and Mallory's pen and his own book, and said he would require the meeting house for an hour, with women present and with the vestry, if they meant to remain useful to the Lord in a county that had children in it. He did not state authority. He borrowed it from the sound that still lived under the eaves. Nathaniel did not follow. His vest contained a key that had ceased to be a key and become a bruise one cannot show for reprieve. He looked to Temperance for reprieve and found instead a face he had not allowed her to grow into until now, older and unwilling to pretend she could be flattered into complicity. He looked to Ruth and saw a copyist fit to apprentice God. He looked at Liddy and did not recognize the equation on her mouth. He looked at the poorhouse girl and saw the person whose name he had turned into a budget item. He looked at Moses and Charity and understood nothing about what held them upright and nearby. The meeting house door stood open like a mouth, and people came of all sizes to stand in its cool and listen to paper confess. Mallory read blue aloud without frill. The justice put his finger on names the room already knew and asked nothing. He merely ensured the sound of them traveled to rafters that would repeat those names when rain came through in fall, and the men who sat in otherwise forgot themselves. Trammell placed his hand on the vestry volume and did not add an entry. Temperance stood near the back with Eliza, and the two women breathed in tandem like bellows working a new fire. By the time sun sat at a decent angle, the parish paper had been held long enough not to move a child. Later, the justice wrote on it in black, a word that would go to sleep between two lines and wake to mean no. The quiet ledger did not leave the meeting house. It stayed under Mallory's eye. No thief that, merely a man who had been told by a bell to make of his hand a shelf until someone with authority learned to be ashamed. Nathaniel returned to his desk and found there a tin of grease and no seal, a blotter and no power. He put his hand on the desktop and felt the faint grit of flour in the grain where Charity had dusted and girls had set arms, an honest residue that his wiping could not undo. He looked at the bell-rope door in a new silence, a silence that made a man realize he had nothing to say. He reached for the warm closet out of habit, as men will hold the familiar even after it has held them to account. The lower bolt slid out, friendly to women and offended by the use he had taught it. The upper bolt sat in pride and then learned to come out too. The door opened on bread rising and a shelf holding useful tins, and the sheath of heat that makes a room generous. He closed it gentle and left the latch unseated like a person who had learned, belatedly, what a door is for. Ruth walked the girls to the porch and showed them the road, not to teach escape, to teach belonging. Liddy stood with her back to the house and felt the sun find the parts of her the warm closet had been asked to modify. The poorhouse girl stood nearest the bell-rope door without flinching, an intimacy she would one day tell a child of her own as if it were a fairy story. Moses took his hand from the jam and did not put it back. A liberty. Charity took the tin and returned it to its good work. Temperance let the rope rest and went to the table because a day still requires feeding even when it has learned to refuse. Eliza sat on the settle and put her hand on the cushion where a man's weight had been and did not bother to be pious about disliking the impression. The cart turned in the lane and went away empty. The horse took the rein as if the world had not asked anything of it. The gull left because dignity required it. The meeting-house bell, later, made one plain evening sound that said nothing about grace and everything about staying. By night the house had decided on a posture. It did not swallow. It allowed. That is the difference between an engine and a home. The latch on the warm closet faced out and lay where a person could move it without prayer. The little cupboard for the rope slept without the key that had once claimed it. Nathaniel folded his vest and set it on the chair, and the bruise it had made remained, a better lesson than any line in any book he had kept. He put his hand to it and did not call for sympathy. Outside, frogs took up their useless arguments again. The bay lay down and liked itself, a rare favor. The road kept its light track under the moon. The house, which had been overtaught, began that night the slow unlearning that comes to rooms when women have been allowed to touch iron without anyone writing it down against them. Morning took the house without argument. Light found the places it had been kept from and stood there like a neighbor who finally had something decent to say. The lane held 2 wheel tracks where an errand had given up its nerve. The bay made a flatter sound on the shore like breath let out after a stubborn hour. The small cupboard in the hall slept with its door easy, the rope coiled in a way that did not suggest jail. The warm closet wore its heat as a kindness, not a threat. In rooms like this, you can tell by the first clatter of a spoon whether a day intends mercy. It did. The meeting house kept the quiet ledger under Mallory's eye for a week. He did not read it for entertainment. He read it like a person tasked with washing a body. He took down names into a separate hand, not to publish, to keep them from going missing when men tidied their desks. The justice opened the doors and held a plain hour that anyone could attend. He spoke not of sin but of habit, and how the county would no longer let habit call itself law, when law had learned to be ashamed. He wrote a line into the parish book that sounded like procedure. No placements or guardianships without the meeting house open. 2 mothers present if God provides them. A clerk who will refuse to write if the bell has rung in disapproval. It was not statute. It was a knot tied where men had always left ropes loose. It held. Willis Trammell declined to set his pen to anything new that week. He said the vestry book would gain holiness by omission. That was likely the best he had in him. He sat at the back on Sunday and sang in a lower voice and did not scold anybody for losing the tune. The preacher, having discovered that doors make better metaphors than he had been taught, preached plain on gates and outfacing latches and the difference between a fold and a cage. He meant it. Folks heard themselves in the talk and said amen without flair. The parish decided about the poorhouse children with less ceremony than the week had earned, often how the better settlements come. The boy settled with the cooper under a different paper that named him apprentice without curlicue, and Moses made a habit of stopping by the shop on his fence errands to let the child hear a voice that remembered him from an unrecorded day. The girl, written briefly as placeable, stayed. Ruth taught her letters with the patience of someone who had learned to copy lines she did not believe. And Liddy taught her to cut cloth straight, and Charity taught her to keep her hands steady over heat. She had no title in the house. Some days that felt like lack, most it felt like permission. Nathaniel Ash's power thinned not dramatically. It ran out of his day like water that finds a new gully after a rain. He still wrote the store ledger and made men sigh with how exact a column looks when debt and credit face off like soldiers on a green. He still kept a tidy yard that impressed a stranger before supper, but he did not set hands to bolts without making a visible choice. He learned to ask Temperance if the rope wanted waking. The little bruise in his waistcoat place resolved, and he wore no key thereafter. The vest suited him better without effect. He went to the meeting house once, late, and sat in a back pew with the posture of a man who has discovered contrition without the words to dress it in. He nodded when the justice read names and did not interrupt the reading. Temperance exhaled a slow month's worth of air in a week and then stopped measuring her breath and started measuring bread again. She had not planned to become the kind of woman a house looks to before deciding which noises to keep, but that is what happened. She saw Eliza through her little account with no collateral but patience. A cousin's security turned into a neighbor's conscience and nothing more. She kept her hand on the jam most evenings at dusk, as if greeting an animal that had finally learned not to bite. If a stranger asked why, she would have said she had come to like the feel of wood and left it at that. Ruth's hand, trained into a pretty tool for other people's phrases, found better work. She wrote receipts, yes, and letters for those overproud to admit their mouths can keep promises their pens cannot. But she also wrote names of girls on small slips and kept them in a tin by the stove. Names of those who had been counted as units in other books. When she had 30, she folded them into a length of cloth that had served in the warm closet and took them to the meeting house and asked Mallory to put the cloth on a shelf where minutes made the room lonely. He did. On days when the preacher couldn't find his verse, he took the cloth down and set it near his Bible until a word arrived. Liddy took to the yard, because girls sometimes claim dirt when rooms have too much history. She walked the fence with Moses and learned to count rails by feel, then taught Thomas the trick. She went to town with Temperance the first time without needing to ask, because the road, like the door, had learned to face outward. In a year, she took work 2 mornings a week at a mercer's widow's counter, adding sums for women whose husbands like to be ignorant of thread prices. She came home those days bright with the relief that comes when a mind has been fed the work it craves. She stood at the kitchen door at dusk and touched the latch as if telling it, softly, that she would let the next girl pass without making her ask. Thomas grew a bit and did not lose the habit of drawing little squares where rope lives. He scuffed fewer of them away because nobody hushed him for marking the place a sound comes from. He learned to ring once at noon when Charity asked, and not to test it, because bells are not toys even when they get used right. Charity, released from being the house's keeper of secrets, returned to her better uses. She cooked like war was over. She took bread to 3 doors that had once been complicit, not as kindness, to make it hard for those to forget what they had eaten. She taught June to tie her hair in a way that keeps it out of hinge mouths, and she set the tin of grease out of sight, not because she would not need it, but because she did not want the room to see it and remember its other job. Moses walked a little further on his errands, to the farther fence line where the marsh vowels mud in a person's mouth. He stood at the far post and looked over the bay at the line where water meets sky and thought about men who spend their lives measuring horizons they will not seek. He returned by the road, not the back path, because his feet had decided sometime in the night they could expect to be seen. The ledger stayed a while. Mallory resisted calls to burn it simply because fire satisfies quickly, and the parish had been addicted to quick satisfactions. He read a page to the vestry each month until the book's own shame grew heavy enough for men to ask to stop. He copied out a single list. No amounts, no marks, only names, and the phrases that had done such work in Nathaniel's hand, and tacked it inside the meeting house cupboard where coats hang. Men saw it when they reached for Sunday and did not make announcements about it. They adjusted their shoulders so as not to brush the paper, a clumsy courtesy that accomplished more than speeches. In time, the book itself mildewed and softened into something that refused to be a weapon. When it fell apart in his hands one spring, Mallory fetched a shovel without theatrics and laid paper in a hole beside the meeting house lilac. He did not sing. He did not moralize. He patted the ground and washed his hands and returned to the desk where he could do more good without thinking himself the hero. People changed in the way they do when a door has taught them a lesson they refuse to dramatize. Parmenter, who had once carried a pad-like intention, stopped writing certain lines and started walking boys home instead of riding past with a note. The Cooper's boy, now taller, tipped his hat to women not as performance. Eliza's debt died quietly of neglect. Willis Trammell's book grew pages that did not mention placements. He found near the back room for receipts for flour he had bought from Charity's cousin 3 lanes over, and did not try to get the woman to write her name when she preferred a mark. The preacher stopped asking the bell to prove he was present and let it say so for itself. One evening the rope rang once in no one's hand, a breeze event, and Liddy, standing by the pump, put her palm to the kitchen jamb and smiled because wood keeps better company when it remembers both kinds of sounds. The ordered one's men's schedule and the honest one's a day makes up. The poorhouse girl, no longer anybody's entry, came to the door and looked out the way people do when they have at last a different next. She rested her fingers on the latch and did not turn it, because she did not have to. The latch faced her without censure. She liked the look of it. Nathaniel took to walking the rooms before supper without telling the doors what to do. It made him uneasy, the way air weighs itself in a house that has converted. He endured the feeling because it was preferable to the other, which had been silence serving him without consent. He stood once by the rope cupboard and pressed 2 fingers to the wood and understood, nearly, that nothing inside belonged to him. He did not tell anyone about this thought. It did him more good for being unsaid. Autumn did its good work. The geese left, the insects calmed, the bay learned a dark blue that suits a year deciding whether it did right. The kitchen stored jars, the warm closet took on a smell of herbs, the yard learned new footpaths. On late afternoons, Temperance took a chair to the end of the gallery and watched light choose the boards one more time before it went. and sometimes the bell rang once for evenness, and sometimes it did not, and both felt like an answer. The house kept what it could. It remembered Ruth's oil in the ledger's margin and decided that not everything placed on paper becomes a law. It remembered the brief illness of wax and how that taught a boot humility. It remembered a girl's shoulder against a door, the precise place where insistence converts into motion. It remembered a woman's hand on a cupboard that learned decency, not magic. It remembered a man sitting down and not knowing which piece of furniture deserved his weight. Years shifted their attention elsewhere, as years will, and the road took other stories up and put new ones down. The children lengthened. The poorhouse girl grew into a woman people in town greeted by both names, and not one of them was placed. Moses's hair went pepper. Charity's wrists learned to ache and then forgave themselves. Nathaniel found his comfort in smaller matters: weather, prices, grandchildren that learned to prefer the porch to the front room, and the front room to the desk, and the desk to the rope, as children do when living in a house that has decided finally that it will live. On an ordinary winter noon, a boy visiting not Thomas but someone the road had delivered to learn a word or two, put his hand on the warm closet latch and turned it without awareness of any history. He took out a loaf that had risen under Charity's supervision and set it on the board with a noise that has always made neighbors kinder. He ate his slice on the step and left crumbs that no ledger will ever charge him interest on. The rope hung visible in the hall, a coil without threat. The bell called folks to stew and not to judgment. At dusk, Temperance stood where she had stood that first hour her house insisted on being honest, and rested her palm against the jamb. The wood had a slight shine there now, the way tools do when touched by a good hand over years. She did not pray. She let the thing she had chosen talk back into her skin, a conversation that required no clerk. Beyond the yard, the road held a soft wheel track where somebody decent had passed earlier and not broken anything. The bay breathed like a child asleep. The bell rang once, small and sufficient. The latch faced the road. The house agreed, and the ground kept the sound without swallowing it, which is as much justice as most places know how to manage, and sometimes enough.